22. In the end, the Hyundai was the only lead they had, and desperate, they tried to leverage it. The premise, as Payne patiently explained it to the team assembled at the next early morning conference, was simple. Sort through the mobile phone numbers that had pinged cell towers near the crime scene in the hours surrounding the murders. If one of the numbers belonged to someone whose name also appeared on their expanded master list of white Hyundai Elantra owners, then they had their suspect. It was a very smart idea, unless the murderer was smarter. A shrewd killer might very well have turned off his phone before heading out to kill 4 people. And when they completed the search, the bottom line was a heartache. None of the owners of the suspiciously pinging cell phones also owned an even more suspicious white 2011 to 2016 Hyundai Elantra. But investigations, like wars, proceed simultaneously on several fronts. And even as they were striking out 300 miles up north in the pleasant city of Meridian, the specialists at the Idaho State Police Forensic Services Laboratory had been quietly laboring away. They had found a single trace source of male DNA on the button snap of the leather K-bar sheath the killer had left tangled in the sheets on Maddie's bed. It was, they hoped, the solid clue that could crack the case wide open. The consumer DNA kits that are sold in any CVS need about 750 to 1,000 nanograms of the substance as a threshold amount to solve genetic mysteries. That's not much. It's smaller than a speck of floating dust and a whole lot less substantial. A single nanogram weighs a trillionth of a pound. There's nothing to it. Crime scenes often contain a whole lot less DNA than that. Forensic teams will routinely wind up with only 100 or so nanograms of DNA. Nevertheless, time after time, lab technicians have peered long and hard into their microscopes and wound up being able to apply even this minuscule amount to nail a criminal. The Idaho lab's challenge, however, was that the DNA on the knife sheath was touch male DNA left by a finger that had brushed against the metal snap, and it amounted to less than 100 nanograms. A whole lot less. In total, the scientists would grumble, about 20 cells, maybe even fewer. Getting the information they needed from a specimen that tiny was tough, but by November 20th, they had processed a sufficient amount of DNA. Now the mood in the lab took on a new energy. They just needed to jump through one more investigative hoop, and the case would be on its way to being solved. And this next exercise, they felt with a certainty reinforced by past experience, would be the easy part. The Idaho lab swiftly ran the DNA profile they'd unearthed from the button snap of the knife sheath through CODIS. The FBI's combined DNA index system held an impressive inventory of genetic information, offering swift access to the entire body of DNA profiles collected from crime scenes throughout the country, as well as genetic samples from all convicted felons, sex offenders, and even unidentified human remains. There were over 20 million profiles in CODIS, and the Idaho team liked the odds of someone who had killed 4 people having acquired a criminal history. Only the system couldn't make a match. The identity of the man whose DNA was on the button of the knife sheath was not in CODIS. But then they got lucky. To understand the genesis of what improbably happened next, it is necessary to go back 8 years to September 2014. A sun-kissed Indian summer morning then, as a kayaker paddled with impressive energy down the fast-moving waters of the Snake River. All of a sudden, his wandering gaze landed on an object floating limply in the distance beneath the Perrine Bridge in Jerome County, Idaho. Curious, he broke course to investigate and discovered a woman's body. Over the next 4 years, investigators headed down a winding and exhausting trail in an attempt to determine the identity of the woman, and why she'd wound up floating face down in the cold waters of the Snake River. They combed the area, checking the local restaurants, motels, bus depots, and taxi services. Photos of what remained of the dead woman's face, as well as her fingerprints and DNA samples, were run through national databases. 14 states reached out to the Idaho State Police thinking the Jane Doe matched descriptions of missing persons they were pursuing. All the arduous detective work, however, led nowhere. In August 2020, the case was officially classified inactive. The voluminous evidence folders stuffed into the dusty file drawers that were the burial grounds of the frigidly cold cases. But then, in relatively rapid succession, a flurry of unforeseen yet fortuitous events occurred. For starters, Matthew Gamet, the director of the Idaho State Forensics Lab, was a scientist with a master's in microbiology. And he had been following with an avid attention the resourceful ways investigative genetic genealogy, IgG in the parlance of the forensic trade, had lately been used to turn up the heat on cold cases. In 2018, to cite one celebrated example, California detectives had been at last able to identify the particularly vicious murderer and rapist known as the Golden State Killer by tying the DNA he had left at the crime scene to family members who had previously submitted their DNA voluntarily to public genetic databases. Gamet figured what had worked in California would work in Idaho too. He applied for and won a $3 million grant from the Federal Bureau of Justice Assistance to fund genetic testing for use in long-standing unsolved cases. Spurred by the grant of government dollars, Idaho officials announced that the state was seeking bids from private companies that had expertise in advanced forensic testing. The bid was won by Othram, a small startup company based outside of Houston, Texas. And one of the first seemingly dead-end cases Gamet sent their way was the mystery of the identity of the female corpse. The coroner had ruled suicide as the cause of death, that had been found 7 years earlier drifting down the Snake River. Othram solved the mystery. Their scientists were able to use the minuscule amount of DNA from the corpse that had been preserved over the years to assemble a clear genealogical history. And the many-branched genetic family tree that took root led police investigators to a name. That of a woman who had gone missing nearly a decade ago from her home in San Diego. Case closed. 4 months later, that unlikely success got Gamet thinking. What if Othram could use its unique capabilities not just on cold cases, but also on a very hot one? A case whose solution might very well be embedded in the microscopic DNA left on the button snap of a knife sheath.